Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us bright and early if you're in the US, and in your afternoons and evenings if you're on other sides of the world. We're going to give it maybe 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll start. But thank you so much for being here and happy June. Happy birthday to anyone whose birthday is today. So yeah, let's give it a minute more and then we'll kick off. We have such a fun presentation today, and I hope you enjoy it just as much as we have in putting it together. You're going to hear from two absolute rock stars, and I'm just as excited as all of you to hear them and learn from them. So we're nearly there. Let's see, 9:01 here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Right. Okay, I think we can get started. We have quite the quite the set of conversations to have today. So let's get started and people will join when they can join. So again, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We're thrilled to be here and thrilled to have you. I'm going to speed talk through the housekeeping. So first of all, we're the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. We're based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we're an academic research institute here. And in terms of housekeeping, of course, you're here to hear about from principle to practice how institutions and business can lead a just transition. We have a chat function, so please introduce yourselves, engage with each other, engage with us on the chat. And then we also have a Q&A where we'd love to take your questions, keep popping them in, and we will try to address all of them on this call. But if we don't get to that, we will follow up wherever possible. I have two wonderful speakers with us. I myself am Yakutia Fatehi. I'm a program manager here on the performance measurement and impact team at WDI. And then joining me today are Diana Páez and Amanda Ullman. So Diana is the Senior Director for Energy and E-Mobility at WDI. So she's my colleague. Through her research and projects, she's driving just transitions to sustainable energy solutions and e-mobility in low and middle income countries, which is the focus of WDI's work as well. Her work includes generating knowledge, supporting clean technology innovators, and working with partners to strengthen local ecosystems across policy, workforce, and innovation. Amanda works at the Institute for Energy Solutions for University of Michigan, so very much a Go Blue team over here today. She is a research specialist focused on employing qualitative and quantitative analysis to assess and support justice in energy transitions at local, national, and global scales. So what we're going to do today, as in terms of just the layout of this, is we'll start with some foundational concepts of just transitions. Then we'll drive home theory through some real world examples. And then we'll open up to questions. So yes, please do add your questions on the Q&A tab. Sometimes what happens on the chat is if you add your questions, it may get lost. So the chat is more to introduce yourselves, to engage with one another. And then the Q&A tab is where you put the questions. And so with that, I'm going to get started. I'm going to be the slide master. So you will hear some. Next slide, please. So apologies in advance. Also, big thanks to Glocal and GEI for this platform. We actually have a full week of events. We have events tomorrow and Tuesday and Wednesday that are being led by my colleague, Heather Esper. And then I have another webinar that I'm moderating and speaking on Thursday, which is focused on business, community engagement, and women empowerment. So shameless plug, but a whole week of events at WDI. So do catch us on more of them as well. All right, handing over to Amanda, who's going to take us through the foundational knowledge about just transitions. and over to you.
Great. Thank you, Yakutia, and thank you everyone for coming today. So first, we can start just by having a really general understanding of the just transition. Yakutia, we can go to the next slide. So when we're thinking about just transitions, we're really introducing concepts of justice into sustainability transition. So instead of looking just at environmental factors, for instance, now we're introducing concepts like economic and social and cultural consequences. And we're looking at how to maximize outcomes of justice in the future, and also looking how we might prevent future injustices and rectify present and past injustices that have arisen with the construction of our current societal structure. So oftentimes when we're looking at just transitions, this like classic example that comes to mind is these ideas of communities that are economically dependent on coal and face major disruptions as global markets for fossil fuels are contracting during these sustainability transitions. We can go to the next slide. In my research, I've been really curious to dive a lot more deeply into what exactly this concept of the just transition meant. And I especially wanted to know how global policymakers and really prominent actors were understanding it. So as part of my doctoral research, I looked at 75 different frameworks published by different governments and multilateral institutions, development banks, just try to start understanding this more clearly. And what I found is that the definitions really range in terms of scope and sectors. And so we'll dive into that a little bit here. Yakutia, can we go next slide? So we can start looking first from a private company perspective, looking at this definition from EDF France, which is the provider, the electricity provider in France. They're really focused internally about this concept of just transitions and looking about how they're incorporating environmental and social ambitions into their own net zero strategy. Next slide. For nonprofits, though, they're looking at this in a more globalized way and looking at all these intersecting categories, but their sectoral focus really differs. So here for German nonprofit Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, they're looking at the just transition really solely from a fossil fuel and economic perspective and talking about how shuttering of fossil fuel-based economies needs to be accompanied by policy agendas that are ensuring that workers who are losing their jobs or their incomes are being economically supported. And also that there's aid flowing into the communities that they're from that are economically reliant either entirely or substantially on these fossil fuel industries. Next slide. And we can see here that now this definition of the just transition is really starting to divert away from just this traditional fossil fuel focus. So here, journalism organization Carbon Brief is talking about how now there's conceptualizations of the just transition in terms of agriculture and trying to understand how to reduce the impacts of agriculture while also ensuring the livelihoods of those who cultivate, produce, and process the world's food. Next slide. So when we're looking at these frameworks, really there's a couple rules that they're providing here for our own understanding. We can use them first to understand whose idea of justice is really being privileged here, because it's a subjective notion and it's going to differ between regions and cultures, religions, sourcing what's being prioritized. And we're also getting a sense for the scope of these huge policies that they'd like to implement. So looking at what are the ultimate goals that are wanting to achieve, who is actually recognized as having faced an injustice that deserves to be rectified in these transitions, what industries and what sectors are being included, are we including future generations as well as our current generation? And overall, when we're looking at all these different actors that are working together, we're asking ourselves, who's going to do what and when are they going to do it? And next slide. So when we're thinking about this from a measurement perspective, the frameworks are really giving an idea of how we can operationalize this very subjective term. And they're giving a sense of what criteria should be included when we're trying to evaluate the success of these just transition strategies. So in my own research, yeah, we can go next slide. in my own research, I was looking at these 75 different frameworks and trying to pinpoint what are all the components that these various organizations thought were essential to their own idea of a just transition. And what I found is that amongst these frameworks, there are 82 different concepts that appeared amongst this literature, and they fell into these 5 different boxes. So looking at economic, environment and energy, jobs and labor, governance, and social justice components. And next slide. So here we can see all of those 82 concepts laid out here. And I've highlighted in red just the wide range of sectors that are already being included in this conversation. So again, looking at this idea of agriculture and food sustainability, but also incorporating things like tourism and waste and water management, manufacturing, affordable housing, internet access, and transportation access into this conversation. And so next slide, we can see there is some uniformity in how these organizations are thinking about this topic. So basically 5 concepts emerge as the most popular here. One, talking about the fact that with all these different actors working together, there does need to be a sense of coordination in how these policies are being implemented. But then also thinking about how are the most vulnerable or historically marginalized communities able to effectively and inclusively participate in these policy designs, and how are we making sure that policies are addressing current societal inequities and inequalities. And then above all, the most common concept that was found amongst these frameworks was that workers that might be in industries that are facing these large-scale contractions really need to have skills development programs available to them so that they have the skills necessary to be able to participate in labor markets that undergo these transitions during these really huge societal changes. So we'll just finish up with some considerations for what this all means when we're thinking about just transitions. First, there are some really universal expectations that we just talked about there. But with all those 82 different concepts, there is a lot of diversity, and even amongst regions, we see there's very different definitions of what should and shouldn't be included. And we especially see this in terms of differences between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. And this lack of coordination is concerning, especially when we're thinking about funding criteria or program and policy evaluations, or even the suitability of the programs that are being implemented in many low and middle income countries. And not just amongst the frameworks, but there's also huge discrepancies in what these global policymakers are thinking about the just transition versus what communities themselves think is most important for their own livelihoods and their own needs. And so that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on in this presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. So, I used to have this misconception, right, that just transitions was only about the clean energy sector. And so your slide that took us through all those different sectors that it applies to was really eye-opening. And then the other thing that I picked up, which will be a really nice segue into handing it over to Diana, was that this is not just about policymakers or companies, right? It includes stakeholders like communities, it includes stakeholders like the workers, the experts, and who those experts are going to be, and how do we ensure that we're looking at all 3 timelines, right? So we're not just future oriented, but we're also past oriented. What have we learned from the past? And how do we ensure that we're not just reusing those old practices of the past that may have made the marginalized even more marginalized? And that we're also looking at, okay, in the present, what are we dealing with right now, right? So it's all 3 timelines kind of combined into one. So those were my first initial set of key takeaways, and I think they set up Diana really well, who's going to take us into our first example with the Philippines. Handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Yakutia. It's great to be here. And yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. I think you set it up and provided really insightful observations about just transition. And now I'd like to talk about an example from the Philippines based on some of our work right now with partners there, and share some of those insights or things we have been learning along with our partners to delve into more specifically and more concretely, how does it play out, in this case? Next, please. So, and the focus of this research has been on the transition to electric mobility. So anything we can think about related to transitioning or replacing internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles as part of that broader clean energy transition. And so this is the focus of this example. And to provide a little bit of context, the Philippines is undertaking multiple efforts from the government policy perspective, but also with really a wide range of stakeholders involved in making moves and making strides to advance e-mobility transition in the country. And so some of the features of the transport sector in the Philippines, which are also in most cases, I think, applicable across other Asian countries, include these 6 that I have here, just to provide a little bit of a picture, comparatively speaking, to other contexts. So you see low personal vehicle ownership, although that's growing really fast. There is a very important component for a need for paratransit to fill gaps in formal transportation systems. It's very crucial, especially for first and last mile connectivity. We are talking about generally informal services, so really there's a very, very high proportion of informal workers across the transport system. And this matters because that usually means that there are less social protections and benefits and also wages, et cetera, that could help workers withstand big transitions. That leads to more vulnerable workers. We also find that women are substantially underrepresented as workers and users over these transport systems. This is also the case globally, but in this case, we're talking specifically about the Philippines. And in low and middle income countries, there's typically limited resources or less robust regulations in some cases, which again is a compounding factor in terms of having social protection systems or alternatives for workers. And so keeping these front and center can help us just tease out a little bit more some of those implications of the shift that have to do with ensuring a just transition. Next. So in the context of transport electrification, and we are sitting here in Michigan, and we see a lot of these aspects also playing out right here with the transition from internal combustion engine to electric vehicle production. So in the Philippines, similarly, even though the context is very different, some of the implications are similar. As we shift to e-mobility technology, the current systems in place were built around internal combustion engine technology and all of those structures as well, come into some, under pressure to change and adapt based on this new paradigm, right? There are things that are quite different in terms of producing, operating, using, disposing of, et cetera, electric vehicles. And so the point here when we think about just transition is that while this transition certainly opens up a lot of new opportunities for businesses, for workers, et cetera, it also implies that there will have to be these substantive changes to be able to adapt to this new shift. And so the challenge, and I think that has come up also in other sectors, is to successfully sync the opportunities with those challenges or with those gaps and ensuring that particularly affected workers can take advantage of new opportunities. So when we seek to adopt a just transition lens in terms of thinking through the transition to electric mobility, we should think in terms of people as workers, users of the transport system, and also community members who might be impacted by this big shift. Next. And here, just to delve a little bit more deeply into some of these impacts, and I know there's a lot going on this slide, but bear with me. So you can see here, in terms of at the very bottom, you can see here from low to high EV adoption. The point here is that as EV adoption grows and also production, when we think about the ICE, the internal combustion engine economy, and in this case, supply chain and the jobs that go along with those, we will start seeing a little bit of a decrease on that, while there are EV gains when we think about jobs. So there's an impact on jobs. Some are reduced and then eventually phased out over a, of course, longer time period. And then there are opportunities in terms of EV manufacturing, assembly, charging stations, batteries, etc., that come up. And this means that there are both direct and indirect impacts to people involved in these technologies. And so direct impacts, as you can see, from upstream to downstream, jobs will be changing. There are new competencies that are needed. There's a big role, of course, for academic and training institutions to play here. And new areas are opening up. And then at the same time, some others are phasing out. In terms of indirect impacts, that means that there is a decrease in indirect jobs that are kind of a little bit farther up the supply chain as well, and induced jobs such as for local retail or restaurants in places, for example, close to ICE vehicle manufacturing plants. There's also reduced local spending in host communities. Again, this is the case in communities with high concentration of ICE-related businesses. Doesn't mean that it's the case everywhere, but that's another indirect impact to take into account. And then in terms of the timing, we are seeing that the pace of the transition is moving ahead. The direction is very clear, but the timing varies depending on the context, on the country, on the region as well. And then here, I just want to point out at the very bottom, so some of the additional effects we could see from this, there's, for example, even to petrol station attendants or gas station attendants, after service jobs, etc. And then transport operators, when they're required to use EVs, or when there is this shift and they need to replace their EV fleet, as is the case in the Philippines. And so I'm just going to delve a little bit deeper into that aspect. Next, please. So this is a very relevant example in the Filipino context. So we have the jeepneys, which are an essential way for people to move around the cities, and they're also a very significant source of employment in the Philippines. And they are quite really cultural icons. If you're not familiar with them, I definitely encourage you to look them up. And they're colorful, etc. At the same time, they are highly polluting vehicles and also pose some safety risks that have been very well documented. There's a lot of research around the jeepneys, and they are a key segment for electrification in the country, for transport electrification, and they are included in some government mandates to start modernizing and sort of transitioning this fleet, along with additional changes to the way they operate in the Philippines. And so in this case, one particular aspect of just transition in the Philippines is that transport operators that manage these fleets, in particular the small-scale ones that are informal, face a lot of challenges in seeking to modernize these vehicles, which again includes absolutely replacing them with electric vehicles, and also in some cases other types of vehicles like Euro 4, but I won't go into those types of details. However, there is very clear recognition of the need to address the displacement of workers affected by this shift by both government stakeholders and also other entities and players in the Philippines ecosystem. And so we have to think about the affordability of these new vehicles. Do the transport operators have the tools to be able to actually proceed with this shift? Will there be reduced employment opportunities as a result of the transition? If so, what are alternative livelihoods for these individuals to have as well? And then will there be enough capacity so that they can comply with new requirements that are perceived in some cases to favor large companies? Again, thinking about that informal system and the way it has been set up. Next. So the question here is, how can we broaden the conversation to address impacts and to really sort of highlight some of those implications? And one way that we've been thinking about it is around some questions that we can ask ourselves as we consider people as workers, users, and members of the community, to understand who's benefiting, who might be burdened, and then how can we ensure fairness in each of the steps. Next, please. And here I offer up a few questions that can be helpful here when we think about those different lenses. So for workers, will ICE displaced workers be able to access reskilling opportunities for EV-related jobs or adjacent jobs? And this goes very much to the point Amanda made. We definitely see here in the context of the Philippines, one of the key topics or factor that is considered is around its skills development for these individuals. And when there are new jobs created, will they be available to affected individuals? Will they have similar or better benefits and protections? Because as part of just transition, we're trying not to exacerbate conditions. We're trying to make conditions better as well. Are there safeguards in place if there is a gap in employment? And are there mechanisms and support so that they can actually proceed with the transition? And then for users, we have to think about how the switch or the changes that are being proposed might impact transport system users. As I mentioned, especially for these types of vehicles, they are largely used by low-income communities because they're very, very affordable and convenient. So then we need to think about the new options actually having or meeting the same type of standards and the same type of, or better standards, but at the same type in terms of convenience, affordability, appeal for the users as well. And then in terms of communities, we have to consider if there are communities that are disproportionately dependent on ICE-related vehicles or employment. Are there services that are related, not exactly focused on ICE, but related and dependent on this as well, that will be impacted? And one of the things that I think we will continue to see is, do communities groups have capacity and resources to pursue such alternatives as well? And will they be able to benefit from the new technology, from all of the aspects of the new technology? Excuse me. So as we understand these impacts, the idea is that we can design, implement, and monitor programs to be able to, from the start, mitigate potentially negative impacts, include all of the affected groups, and lead to more equitable outcomes. And I know we'll discuss a little bit more about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana. I found that slide on the questions especially helpful. So we will send out both the slides as well as the recording so that you guys can have those questions, because it just shows you the layering of direct and indirect impacts, but also the curiosity that is needed amongst the stakeholders, right? And I think the amount of conversation, dialogue, negotiations that would be needed, that's one of the top questions that come to my head as I hear you both speak. So buckle up, everyone. We're actually flying over to Colombia now, and I apologize for my terrible jokes, but here we are. Stuck with me. All right, handing over to you, Amanda.
Those are great jokes. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Diana. Yeah, so now we'll talk about a case that is quite different actually in terms of, but still has very similar issues that arise. So we'll look at some of the work that I did during my field work, during my doctoral work. So we can go next slide, please. So during my doctorate, I studied in La Guajira, Colombia, because this was really an area that really encapsulated a lot of these just transition concerns, but from kind of a new angle of energy, renewable energy development. So for those unfamiliar with it, La Guajira is the most northern state in Colombia. It's a really desertic state, and it's huge in these conversations about sustainability transitions because it has this huge abundance of energy resources there. So it's the home of the largest open pit coal mine in South America. It has the seventh strongest wind energy resources in the world. Because it's a desert, there's really significant solar production, and there's also very significant natural gas production there. And because of this abundance, it's really become the epicenter for a lot of the nation's plans for its own energy transition, and especially for new developments of industries like their hydrogen industry. But it's really important to consider La Guajira in terms of the just transition because it itself has a lot of different injustices, both past and present. Um, so especially because La Guajira typically ranks amongst the highest in the nation for having huge, large, or very low levels of human development indices, and also really high levels of multidimensional poverty, which includes discussions around food and water insecurity, educational attainment, housing security, um, and it's the home of the largest indigenous tribe in Colombia, the Wayuu. And this group often lives in unelectrified areas and faces a lot of these really huge impacts of multidimensional poverty, especially in this desertic area with exacerbations by climate change. There's huge levels of drought and food insecurity. You can go to the next slide. And the discussion in La Guajira is shaped around this historic development of this very large coal mine there that is really just wrought with conflict. So the coal mine was developed before a lot of constitutional protections were put in place to make sure that Indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities were receiving really fair and inclusive ways to participate in important protections during large-scale developments. And so in the development of this massive coal mine, huge amounts of Afro-Colombian and Indigenous communities were displaced from their communities, and a lot of their really sacred and cultural sites were devastated during this development. The development has also just brought around a lot of environmental degradation and has resulted in human health impacts in the surrounding communities, and also just the presence of a multinational energy company in the area introduced a lot of vices and paramilitary actors into the surrounding communities and affected really a lot of safety for the Indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities living in La Guajira. Next slide. Now, with this huge focus on Colombia's national energy transition, they've really tried to take advantage of these super strong wind energy resources in the state. But the development processes have really seemed to be a repetition of very past extractive cycles that we saw with the development of the coal mine. So first, a lot of these wind farms are located directly in their ancestral territory of the indigenous group. And the communities that are negotiating with these multinational energy companies who have all these huge resources and information and capacity behind them coming in, these unelectrified communities that really have experienced a history of isolation in the country have very limited resources available to them to really even these power dynamics between the companies and the communities. And apart from that, there's just been corruption that's been reported rampantly throughout the entirety of the process, not only on the side of the energy companies, but also within the governments, within the NGOs that are supposed to be supporting the communities, and within the communities themselves, who aren't always fairly distributing the benefits that are supposed to be coming to them and all their community members. And apart from this, when we're thinking about this importance of skills development, there are local work requirements that are put in place to ensure that the region is benefiting in terms of labor from these developments of the territories. But because these unelectrified communities who are living really traditional indigenous lifestyles have limited capacity or limited training in the skills needed for the development, the companies are able to have exclusions for this policy and bring in workers from outside of the region. So the communities are hosting the sites, but not really benefiting in terms of jobs. And they're often not even going to be benefiting from electrification because these large utility scale projects are being connected via transmission line directly to the national electricity grid. And this infrastructure is not being built out to support the communities there. And above all, because we see these really high levels of multidimensional poverty, there's really huge necessities for measures to ensure that basic human needs are being met in the area, addressing this food insecurity and this water insecurity. And because things are at such an urgent place where communities are worried about their own survival, any kind of benefits being brought into the territory are huge drivers for conflict within the community who's not exactly at a consensus on what benefits they are negotiating for and how it's going to be distributed amongst the community members, but also between communities, because only some communities live directly near the wind farms and are going to be receiving those benefits. So just by luck, they're the ones who happen to be getting some kind of resources that can address this huge major insecurity in the area. And we can see here all of this conflict and all of these challenges have resulted actually in failure of a lot of these negotiations. So these are all in Spanish because they're from Colombian newspapers here, but I have 3 different headlines at the top here that show that a lot of these projects have been canceled because the negotiations couldn't be successful, and it was just so expensive for the energy companies to even be operating there that they sold the project off and said, this isn't even worth it to us. Next slide, please. And so this case study gives us some kind of takeaways for how we might be structuring these negotiations in the future and the implementation of these policies. So the first being that history and context really matter. We can see that the foundation of these negotiations is resting upon this huge history of conflict with the local coal mine, and communities are already coming in very distrustful and very skeptical about huge energy developments in their area. And because of this distrust and because of the corruption that's already just running through these processes, we can see there's a lot of failures that result, and it's necessary that there's more transparency implemented and more anti-corruption measures to try to kind of address some of this distrust and put more faith in the process. So it seems more of a partnership that's happening between communities and the government and the companies coming in. There's also a need to consider the fact about these very low human development indices and the really vital need to address local food and water insecurity to make sure that communities don't experience this urgency to accept any kind of deal to have money coming in so they can meet these really immediate survival needs that they have. And also just that they have a good foundation so that they were not engendering this huge amount of conflict in the area. We also need just more resources coming in for communities that are unelectrified, often not even having access to internet. It's very hard for them to be able to have any kind of resources available to them that evens out this playing field with the companies. And so overall, we need to think about how we can support negotiations that are directly producing benefits for communities that address their food and water insecurity, that provide some kind of job training or education programs to support local employment, especially if that's something that could accompany these large development programs. And then there needs to be some kind of way that the communities are fairly compensated for all the loss of their ancestral territory that's coming with huge swaths of land being sectioned off and unable for them to access when these large utility scale wind farms are being developed.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Just applying a measurement lens, right? Because this is we are presenting on the Glocal platform from a measurement perspective, right? Even those of us who practice M&E, right? We come in with biases, right? So, for example, all the news tells you like, oh, clean energy products, so many new jobs created, all the CO2 emissions diverted or averted, and so sometimes you come in with that absolutely positive narrative bias. And so it really is a call to action for measurement folks. Like, think about the direct and indirect impacts. Think about the 3 timelines of past, present, and future. Think about what questions should be asked even during negotiations, right? Sometimes measurement folks we're just focused on baseline and end line outcomes. But what happens in the middle? It's a big question mark, right? And I often I always go back to that saying, like, if you don't like the outcomes, look at the process. And that process of negotiation, like the fact that Amanda, you told us that those negotiations, they completely exploded, and in fact these projects didn't go through, like that's huge red flags, right? Like that maybe there's a role for measurement to raise those red flags way in advance, right, rather than at the end. And so with that, we're going to move to a Michigan example, bringing us back home. And this one is a really interesting one because, again, and I've been quite open about sharing all my misconceptions. So, this one also I was really surprised by, and I'm really excited to have Diana share it with you, and maybe it'll surprise you too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yakuta. Yeah, this is also very, very interesting, like you said, and I like that we are sharing examples that are quite different from each other in different contexts. And I think it's important though to underscore that I think even examples of similar types of energy transitions or e-mobility transitions in other contexts would bring up different implications. So that is to say, it's not a blanket statement, because I think if one thing we can take away from this is that it's so hyper local, and it's so much based on the local conditions, who are the players, who benefits, who is burdened, right? And how can we make sure that those opportunities of the clean energy transition, which we do need, right, for so many other reasons, are distributed in a fair way. So I think, I think there are a lot of things to continue talking about. And so this example specifically is about a nuclear power plant here in Michigan that was decommissioned and closed, and then is moving towards recommissioning as well. And this is part of some research we're doing now in terms of Michigan's energy transition, which has been also a really wonderful project to be able to pull out some of those strategies and some of the specific cases. So in this case, we're talking about the Palisades nuclear power plant, and it is an 800 megawatt nuclear power plant that was built in 1971 that is really has been a crucial economic driver in 3 counties here in Michigan: Van Buren, Berrien, and Cass. And so it kind of has that kind of radius that we can see there in the map. In 2020, Palisades electricity contributed 15% of carbon-free power generation in Michigan, so 5.6% of the state's total electricity generation. And one of the key points here, when we think about just transition and some of the main issues, in this case, it's really about economic growth and economic diversification of the community, as we will see. And so during its operation, the nuclear power plant employed 600 workers and supported over 1,100 local jobs. It had a huge contribution to tax revenue in the Van Buren County, the host community. And this is also a really important point when we think about phase outs of or closures of power plants, that they contribute so much revenue to the specific community that is later used for schools, for community programs, et cetera, et cetera. Next, please. And so in this case, the power plant was actually due to a combination of financial and safety concerns. Oh, can we go back one? Okay, one again. There, yeah. It ended up being closed in 2022, and we'll go over a timeline here in a little bit, but there are a lot of different players involved. So again, here we're just trying to highlight some of the aspects that really are useful for us to think through some of the implications as well. And so when we were thinking about or talking about the decommissioning of the plant, there was a really big economic impact immediately, because when such a facility closes, there's of course impacts in terms of direct jobs. Our colleagues at the Economic Growth Institute at the University of Michigan conducted an assessment in 2023. There's again a lot of research, really well documented process for this, based on their own programs, and they estimated the economic impact of the closure. And so you can see here in terms of job losses, when you think about induced and indirect, direct, etc. We went over that for the Philippines example. But in general, just a really, really big economic impact based on the decommissioning. They and other players involved the community via a community advisory panel that was established to include local residents in the process. There are a lot of lessons around including communities proactively early on in terms of this process of some plant that is going to close, and that plays a really big economic role in the community. And so there were a lot of activities facilitated to be able to support community involvement. And then for the dislocated workers, some employees were offered jobs at other facilities, some were retained to work on the decommissioning of the plant, and then some others had retired as well or had to find some other employment. And so you have a variety of impacts here. Next. And so here there was a very intentional effort to support, to develop a recovery strategy for the community. And so here's when you think about a community that depends on a specific plant or business or facility that really is a big contributor to their economic growth, then really the impact and the shift that we're seeing, or the lens, is really focused on developing economic diversification strategies so that the impact can be mitigated, so that people can find other jobs, etc. And so in this case, the Nuclear Closure Communities Program of the U.S. Economic Development Administration was quite involved, as well as the Energy Transition Impact Project here in the state of Michigan, to support key stakeholders in the community to develop an action plan for economic diversification. These are long-term processes. In this case, a 3-year process, a lot of discussions and technical assistance to support the community, thinking about how you can replace or this specific revenue, but also try to identify other alternatives for workers and communities. As these discussions were going on, there was the discussion or the conversation about potentially reopening the plant began to emerge. And so that changed a little bit the dynamics, but there is already this foundation for alternative pathways for the community. Next. And so here's also the interesting things that pretty quickly after the plant was slated for decommissioning and was closed in 2022, the company that acquired this plant pivoted towards restarting the reactor shortly thereafter, driven by several trends. So definitely here in Michigan, in terms of the energy infrastructure, there were already plans to phase out coal-fired power generation sources, shifting views and sentiments about nuclear energy, which continues to see a revival of sorts here in the United States and in other markets as well, and then demand for clean energy increasing. And so based on this, the plans to recommission and to reopen the Palisades nuclear power plant were approved and moving forward with support from the federal government and the state government. And throughout the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, so that's NRC, and Holtec, which is the company that owns the plant right now, they have hosted multiple community meetings and at different points to provide information about the recommissioning process, and hear concerns from local residents and other groups. And these include in general, this is based on a desk review of some of those perspectives. Really, some of the ones that have expressed most concerns around the recommissioning of the plant include households and residents near the community and farmers. And whereas the points around economic growth and those types of advantages, of course, become most important when we think about regulators, local hires, and business owners in the community. Next. And here, I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's just an interesting timeline again. If Palisades moves forward with the plan, it would be the first nuclear power plant in the United States that is recommissioned after being closed. And it is a key part also of Michigan's Healthy Climate Plan goal regarding clean energy. And so there's a broader strategy on the part of the state to be able to produce more clean energy. And so in this case, Michigan has included nuclear energy as part of that. And then another interesting aspect is that the company is focused on and planning to deploy 2 small modular reactors in the mid-2030s as part of this plant. And if they are delivered in time and in budget, they may become the first one in the US to be commercialized, to be deployed. Next. And so In this case, again, it's just to illuminate some of those aspects related to energy transition when we think about community levels. Here, I try to think through the aspect of jobs and job creation, the potential impacts for the local economy, why it matters related to clean energy, and then some environmental concerns that still remain, as you can see in terms of impacts from decommissioning, and first and foremost, the impact in terms of employment, recommissioning, what it might mean for the communities. There are some mechanisms here in the States regarding ensuring that there are community benefits agreements really clear between the company and the host community as well. There are implications related to, as I mentioned, tax revenues, as you can see there, and impacts and opportunities for local businesses. And then the point around clean energy goals. In some cases, of course, critics argue that investing in nuclear may divert resources from other sources, specifically thinking about wind and solar. So there are also, of course, always going to be different narratives and different interests. And then in terms of environmental concerns, some of the ones that are still, there was already an environmental assessment, but in some cases, some of the communities or community members that have expressed concerns are asking for more comprehensive environmental assessments as well. And I think throughout this entire process, thinking through how is the community involved, what are the measures that are put in place to ensure that this is a transition that aligns with justice principles is in the end the main takeaway. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to both of you for those examples, because the project you mentioned, Diana, that you're doing this work for in Michigan, right? I'm lucky enough to be on that project, and you've shared some of the literature review you've done for, and the extensive literature, and I've seen some of it. And like what stands out to me, and from these examples, is that there's no magic wand for this, right? This is big, large-scale structural change, and it requires asking many questions, the right questions, including a variety of voices. And again, I feel like I keep landing on the negotiations that are needed, and the biases that we tend to have, and how do we disrupt those, right? So I want to keep that short because we're going to go into Q&A, and we've got some questions. I'm going to pull up those questions. Thank you so much to those of you who have added them. One of them we have is, what are some of the ways to address these challenges that are being faced by the indigenous communities? Maybe Amanda, you can take that one. And I'm guessing it goes to the Colombia example.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good question. It's probably not one that there's just a single answer to, and probably still we're trying to figure out what's the best way to do this all. And just transitions is so early in implementation. But just from my sense of being there, I think first, as I touched on before, thinking about human development indices, or thinking about this huge sense of multidimensional poverty that's really lingering over the negotiation processes. I think thinking of ways to have support systems to start addressing that is a really important start. I touched on a little bit of this, but just the kind of urgency that it introduces into the processes on the side of the indigenous communities makes it so that communities really don't have time, or are able to take time to weigh out and find resources and connect with experts who can be supporting them. So I think figuring out ways to have large social support systems in that way. And another thing that I saw during my time there was the really important role of some of the local community organizations in bringing different communities together. So community connection ended up being very powerful in these negotiations, because it was a way for communities to share their own experiences in the negotiations with one another. So trying to support capacity internally by sharing best practices, having the community organizations teaching them about what rights they're provided within the country, and just by like the ILO, for instance, what are the rights afforded to these communities, and making sure they have those resources with them. There are some really interesting efforts taking place where I did my master's at Duke University, where some of the academics are coming in and participating in negotiations with community members themselves, and thinking about ways to fairly calculate the benefits that community should be receiving based upon the size of these projects and the amount of revenue that they're going to be generating, or the amount of land area that they're taking up, and what that loss means monetarily to community. So figuring out new ways of translating these impacts. So how do we translate negative impacts into what communities should receive? And also thinking about what are community goals, and trying to, again, operationalize these more subjective ideas and think about ways that either the governments can help be supporting community goals alongside these processes, or perhaps that there's some way that the development occurs with the energy companies, that the energy companies are supporting communities and receiving these goals. So in some cases, the energy companies would help build a community meeting area for all the communities to gather under before negotiations even start occurring, so that one, there's goodwill already on the part of the energy companies with the communities, and two, that the negotiations can occur in areas that are traditionally meaningful, so they're constructed in traditional indigenous construction practices, and already there's some kind of interculturality introduced into the negotiations.
Great. Diana, anything to add from your perspective?
I think no, I think Amanda, I love that that you shared, just more specific examples about how those communities are engaged, and particularly in terms of trying to understand how they can benefit from some of those projects. There was another project here, or case here in Michigan, where I learned a little bit more about some of the solar farm also deployments, and precisely this question around how can we make sure that everybody in the community benefits from them, and not just the people who are, who own the properties or who will have the direct benefits, but what about everybody else in the community? And so I think based on also what you shared at the beginning, the question around boundaries of these impacts, right? And thinking through the different levels of impacts and how much they extend goes back to a comment our colleague made also around that systems thinking. So really thinking about every single aspect is a really tall order, and yet it seems to be the only way that we can actually try to dig a little bit deeper, more deeply into who could be, again, who will benefit, who is burdened, how can these be made in a fair way. So I think all of those points are really valid. And your point, Yakuta, around asking the questions and continuing to learn, I think it's not really about, oh, one person that might be expert on just transition, but it's like, okay, that curiosity, what does it mean here? What are the impacts here? And how can we facilitate the process and make sure that especially the affected communities have the capacity and the resources to participate fully and meaningfully?
Yeah, and something I love that you just said, right? Even so, we always keep focusing again on it's this narrative, right, about the positive benefits and making sure that it's equally distributed. But there are burdens too, Diana, that like you just said. And so how can those burdens also be equally distributed? But tying it to what you said, Amanda, about the power dynamics, right? Um, do power dynamics actually allow burdens to be equally distributed? And yeah, if you guys could comment on that, that would be interesting too.
Yeah, maybe just one thing is that Amanda, you said, the groups, the community being represented. And so I've also noticed or learned in some cases there are, even with groups that are representing the communities, like in some cases there are perspectives that say, yes, they are fully representing the communities. And then in other cases, they're not actually representative of our community, right? Like even who represents the community can also sometimes pose an issue, or be like, well, it wasn't such a big group, or it wasn't as broad as it should have been. So again, I think to your point, Yakuta, is like we're holding so many different things together at the same time. And to the point Amanda made earlier, it is a new-ish, to put it that way, a relatively new concept or goal that what we're trying to achieve here. And so it is going to be a process, a learning process, a journey, an outcome that we're pursuing. And I think the point is, how can we do our very best to incorporate and include all of those different aspects?
Absolutely. And then I'll just add as well too, a lot of the cases where, at least when I was able to participate in some negotiations, I saw some of the power dynamics being leveled out was when communities had access to other community members that had received their own more formal educational training. So bringing in lawyers and planners and people who'd worked in government into the negotiations, representing the communities was one way that could help balance that out. And it's just even more emphasis on the need to make sure that communities have access to education and they have access to opportunities and access to capacity development that they want, and that there's strong ties that allow those representatives to be able to come back into communities and help speak on behalf of them and translate their needs, because often a lot of times perhaps what the communities are prioritizing is something that energy companies coming from high-income countries can't even conceptualize and might not even be initially factored into negotiations, or there might not be a direct monetary translation of the spiritual value of a sacred site or the loss of land. And so thinking about ways to decolonize a lot of these terms and these negotiation processes to incorporate more of the local understanding and local value systems is so important, but of course so complex.
Yeah, I feel like we've just scratched the surface, and this conversation could go on for many more hours, but I'm going to have to say goodbye. And just from this call, right? Like initially you think the stakeholders are okay, you have policymakers, communities, workers, and businesses. But just from this call, I heard you guys talk about civil society organizations, NGOs, academics, lawyers, planners, urban religious heads, the urbanist folks. So just in this 1 hour, my brain has like expanded, which is always my goal, because I'm such a nerd. But yeah, thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to everyone attending. We I hope you've gained as much as I personally have. Thanks again. And yes, you will get the slides, you will get the recording. And if there are any additional resources that we think you absolutely must have, we will include those as well. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.